What if I told you that the most important assassination of the entire Second World War was carried out not by a highly trained secret agent with access to sophisticated weapons and spy networks, but by two ordinary men parachuted into a foreign country in the dead of winter, who spent months hiding in attics, cycling through the streets of an occupied city and relying on the courage of strangers who risked everything just to keep them alive? What if I told you that the target of this mission was not simply a general or a Nazi official, but the man Hitler himself called the Man with the Iron Heart, a figure so feared, so methodically evil, and so architecturally central to the machinery of the Holocaust that his death sent shockwaves through the entire Nazi leadership? And what if the price of success was not just the lives of the assassins themselves, but an act of collective punishment so horrifying that the name of the village destroyed in retaliation became a byword for Nazi barbarism across the entire world? That is exactly what happened in the spring of 1942 in the city of Prague, when two young soldiers fulfilled their mission against all odds and changed the course of history in ways that ripple forward to this very day. In this video, we will trace every thread of Operation Anthropoid, the man who made it necessary, the men who carried it out, the nation that sheltered them, the betrayal that sealed their fate, and the legacy that makes this moment one of the most consequential acts of resistance in the entire story of the Second World War. So, without further ado, let's begin. To understand why Operation Anthropoid was necessary, why two men were prepared to parachute into occupied territory and attempt to kill one of the most protected figures in the Nazi Empire, you have to understand exactly who Reinhard Heydrich was. Not just what his title said, not just his rank in the SS, but what he actually was inside. The mechanisms by which a man of undeniable intelligence, sophistication, and organizational genius could become the single most dangerous individual in an organization already filled with murderers and fanatics. Because Heydrich was not simply a thug in a uniform. He was something far more terrifying. He was brilliant, and he had placed every ounce of that brilliance in the service of systematic mass murder. Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich was born on March 7th, 1904, in Halle an der Saale, a town in the Kingdom of Saxony, then part of the German Empire. His father, Bruno Heydrich, was a composer and opera singer who had founded the Halle Conservatory of Music, and his mother, Elisabeth Krantz, was the daughter of the director of the Dresden Royal Conservatory. The household was cultured, refined, and deeply artistic. As a child, Reinhard showed remarkable talent on the violin, a skill he would continue to practice throughout his adult life, performing chamber music with colleagues even as he signed orders that consigned hundreds of thousands of people to death. There is something almost unbearable in that image, the man who would chair the Wannsee Conference, drawing a bow across strings in his home in Prague, while transports rolled east. But that contradiction was, in many ways, the essence of Heydrich. He inhabited two worlds simultaneously, and found no tension between them whatsoever. His childhood was not entirely comfortable. There were persistent rumours in Halle that his family had Jewish roots, rumours almost certainly false but which pursued Heydrich throughout his life and which he found deeply humiliating. His father's surname, Süß, which had been Bruno's stage name for a period, fueled the whispers. Classmates taunted young Reinhard. He grew up sensitive to perceived insults, acutely conscious of his status, and ferociously driven to prove himself beyond any possible doubt. This may help explain, though it certainly does not excuse, the particular venom with which he would later throw himself into anti-Semitic persecution. There is a psychologically coherent, if profoundly disturbing, thread from the taunted schoolboy to the architect of the final solution. After Germany's defeat in the First World War and the upheaval of the Weimar Republic, Heydrich joined the Freikorps, the paramilitary units that fought communist uprisings in the streets of Germany during the early 1920s. He was already developing the hardness and the political instincts that would carry him far. In 1922, he enlisted in the Reichsmarine, the German Navy, joining as a naval cadet and displaying exceptional aptitude for signals intelligence and cryptography, areas that would prove foundational to his later career. He rose steadily through the ranks, becoming a signals officer, and appeared to be on course for a distinguished naval career. He was athletic, competitive, and accomplished fencer who would eventually hold the national rank of second in the sport, and he was developing a reputation as someone who did not lose in any arena without consequences. His naval career ended in scandal in 1931. He had been engaged to one woman, Lena von Osten, the daughter of a school teacher from a small Baltic island, and simultaneously pursuing another young woman whose father happened to be a senior naval officer. When the affair became known and Heydrich refused to make what the Navy considered an appropriate settlement of the matter, he was brought before an honour court presided over by Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and dismissed from the service in April 1931 for conduct unbecoming an officer. The verdict was essentially that he had behaved dishonourably toward a woman. It was a humiliation that cut deep, and it propelled him, within months, directly into the arms of the organisation that would make him one of the most powerful men in Europe, the SS. The timing was extraordinary. Germany in 1931 was sliding toward political catastrophe. The Nazi Party was ascending rapidly. Heinrich Himmler, who had just been appointed Reichsführer SS, was looking for someone to build an intelligence apparatus for the organisation. A mutual acquaintance arranged a meeting. Himmler, according to several accounts, was immediately impressed. He gave Heydrich 20 minutes to sketch out how he would construct a party intelligence service, and was apparently so taken by the resulting outline that he hired him on the spot. Heydrich joined the SS in June 1931 as an SS Sturmbannführer and set about building what would become the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence arm of the SS. He was 27 years old. What followed over the next decade was one of the most remarkable and sinister careers in modern history. Heydrich was not merely a bureaucrat or a follower of orders, he was a generator of systems, a man who understood how power worked and who designed mechanisms of control with the precision of an engineer. He built the SD into a comprehensive surveillance organization that gathered intelligence on perceived enemies of the Nazi state, including Jews, communists, churchmen, political opponents, and eventually even on senior figures within the Nazi Party itself. Heydrich was not above collecting compromising information on men far above him in the hierarchy. It was widely rumoured, though never conclusively proven, that he maintained files on Himmler, Göring, and even Hitler. Whether or not this was literally true, the perception that he held such leverage contributed enormously to his untouchability. When the Nazis came to power in January 1933, Heydrich's career accelerated with terrifying speed. He orchestrated, alongside Himmler, the takeover of the political police forces in state after state, eventually absorbing the Gestapo, Prussia's secret police, which had previously been under Hermann Göring's control. By 1936, Himmler had been appointed chief of German police across the entire Reich, and Heydrich ran the security. Police and the SD as a combined force that essentially controlled the entire internal security apparatus of Nazi Germany. He was 32 years old and already one of the most feared men in the country. His office at 8 Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin, the headquarters of the Gestapo, became a place whose name alone was enough to cause intelligent, educated people to tremble. Heydrich's methods were not crude. He was not primarily a man of physical violence himself, at least not in the way of some of his SS colleagues who seemed to relish personal brutality. He was a man of systems and files, of information and leverage, of organizational structures designed to make atrocity efficient. He understood that the most durable form of terror was not random violence, but the precisely targeted, bureaucratically administered kind. The midnight knock on the door, followed by the bureaucratic form, the stamp, the transport, the system that processed human beings and produced outcomes according to criteria established far from the scene. This kind of terror was harder to resist than simple thuggery, because it dressed itself in the language of law and administration and gave its perpetrators the psychological shelter of procedure. In November 1938, Heydrich was the central coordinator of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, the nationwide pogrom against Jewish Germans that marked a catastrophic escalation in Nazi persecution. He sent telegrams to SD and police commanders across the country with precise instructions: how many synagogues to burn, how to protect adjacent non-Jewish property from the flames, how many Jews to arrest, which categories of person to prioritize. He brought to the organized destruction of a minority population the same organizational precision he brought to everything else. The fires of Kristallnacht were not spontaneous, they were managed, and the man managing them was Reinhard Heydrich. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the war began, Heydrich organized the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into occupied territories and carried out mass shootings of Jews, communist officials, and other designated enemies. These units, under his direction, killed hundreds of thousands of people in Poland, the Baltic states, and the Soviet Union in the opening years of the war. The Einsatzgruppen were Heydrich's creation, his tool, his answer to the question of what to do with the populations the Nazi regime had designated as subhuman and expendable. The scale of the murders they committed in just the first year of the Eastern Campaign was staggering, and every operational directive, every boundary of authority, every line of reporting flowed back to Heydrich's office. Then came the single most consequential meeting of Heydrich's career, and arguably one of the most consequential meetings in the history of the 20th century. On January 20th, 1942, Heydrich convened the Wannsee Conference in a comfortable lakeside villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. 15 senior Nazi officials gathered around a table, and Heydrich presented to them the plan for what the Nazi regime called the final solution to the Jewish question. The conference did not originate the decision to murder Europe's Jews. That decision had already been made, or more accurately, had evolved through a series of incremental decisions and escalations over the preceding years. What the Wannsee Conference did was coordinate. It brought together the various agencies of the Nazi state and established clearly and bureaucratically the roles each would play in the systematic murder of 11 million Jews across Europe. Heydrich chaired the meeting. He ran it with characteristic efficiency and precision. The minutes, which survived the war and became one of the most damning documents in history, show a man entirely at ease discussing mass murder in the measured language of administrative planning. He spoke of numbers, percentages, logistical challenges, and inter-agency coordination. He was, in short, the man most directly responsible for translating the abstract murder fantasy of Nazi ideology into a functioning, organized, industrial-scale killing enterprise. Adolf Eichmann, who served as Heydrich's specialist on Jewish affairs and who took the minutes at Wannsee, would later say that by the end of the conference the men present were speaking not obliquely but directly, no longer using the word killing but describing it plainly. When Heydrich walked out of the Wannsee villa on that winter afternoon, he was not just the head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of Himmler's senior lieutenants. He was, in practical terms, the operational director of the Holocaust, and the Holocaust was already well underway. The death camps at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were either already operational or nearing completion. The gas vans were rolling across the eastern killing fields. The transports from across Europe were being organized. And Reinhard Heydrich, 37 years old, was the man who had made all of it work. He would live for less than 5 more months. The addition of the role of acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia to Heydrich's already formidable portfolio of responsibilities had come in September 1941, and it represented a significant expansion of his already enormous power. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was the remnant of Czechoslovakia that Germany had occupied in March 1939. The Sudetenland had been absorbed into the Reich proper after the Munich Agreement of 1938, but the Czech heartland, the ancient lands of Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia, had been carved into a so-called protectorate, nominally administered by a Czech government under German supervision, but in practice entirely subjugated to Nazi authority. The Bohemian and Moravian lands were economically valuable to Germany, particularly the Skoda armaments works at Plzeň and the vast industrial complex of the Witkowice steelworks. They needed to be productive, and they needed to be controlled. Heydrich's predecessor as Reich Protector, Konstantin von Neurath, a career diplomat who had served as Hitler's foreign minister before being replaced by Ribbentrop, had pursued a relatively moderate policy in the Protectorate. He had attempted to maintain Czech cooperation through a degree of accommodation, and the result, from Berlin's perspective, was inadequate. Czech resistance was growing. Sabotage of German war production was increasing. The Czechoslovak government in exile in London, led by President Edvard Beneš, was directing intelligence operations and clandestine activities inside the Protectorate with growing effectiveness. Hitler was furious. He wanted the Czechs subdued, their workers producing at maximum capacity for the German war machine, and their resistance networks destroyed. He turned to Heydrich. Heydrich arrived in Prague in late September 1941. His approach was characteristically dualistic and calculated. On one hand, he increased wages for Czech workers in the armaments industries, improved food rations for those contributing to German war production, and offered a degree of material benefit to those who cooperated. On the other hand, he unleashed a wave of terror against the Czech resistance and against anyone suspected of opposition to German rule that was swift, brutal, and systematic, in a way his predecessor's administration had never been. Within days of his arrival, he had declared martial law across large parts of the Protectorate. Within weeks, hundreds of Czechs had been arrested, tried before summary courts, and executed. The first Prime Minister of the Protectorate, Alois Eliáš, who had been secretly in contact with the Beneš government in London, was arrested and eventually executed. The Czech intelligentsia, the professors, the journalists, the cultural leaders who might provide the moral spine of a resistance movement were targeted with particular precision. Heydrich was seen openly in Prague in a way that his status as the most feared man in the Nazi Empire made extraordinary. He drove through the streets in an open-topped Mercedes convertible. He did not use a fully armoured vehicle. He did not travel with an overwhelming security detail. He was, in a very deliberate and calculated way, projecting confidence. He was telling the Czechs, "I am not afraid of you. You cannot touch me." The psychological message was clear and it was effective in its own terms. But it was also, as would become apparent, a catastrophic miscalculation. Among those watching all of this from London was Edvard Beneš and the senior officers of the Czechoslovak government in exile's intelligence service. Beneš was in a deeply uncomfortable position. He needed to demonstrate to the Allied powers, particularly Britain and the United States, that Czechoslovakia was actively contributing to the war effort, not merely existing in diplomatic limbo as a government that had lost its country. Czech pilots were flying with the RAF and performing with distinction. Czech soldiers were training in Britain for eventual deployment. But Beneš needed something more dramatic, something that would announce to the world that Czechoslovakia was still fighting. And as Heydrich settled into Prague and his terror campaign intensified, the idea began to form. What if the government in exile could reach inside the Protectorate and strike at its oppressor directly? The decision to plan an assassination operation against Heydrich was not arrived at quickly or easily. There were serious debates within the exile government and between the exile government and British intelligence about whether such an operation was wise. The concern was not primarily about feasibility, though that was formidable, but about reprisals. Everyone who thought carefully about the situation understood that killing a figure of Heydrich's importance would provoke a German response of devastating violence against the Czech civilian population. History had already provided examples. The murder of German officials in occupied countries had triggered collective punishments of shocking severity. Was it worth it? Could any strategic or symbolic gain justify the deaths of innocent Czech civilians that would certainly follow? Beneš and the senior Czechoslovak military leadership ultimately concluded that it was. Their reasoning was complex and has been debated by historians ever since. Part of it was strategic. Removing Heydrich from his position as the effective operational director of the Holocaust was a genuine military objective, not merely a symbolic one. Part of it was political. The government in exile needed to demonstrate its relevance and its fighting capacity. And part of it was, almost certainly, something harder to articulate. A moral imperative, a statement that this particular man, overseeing this particular scale of atrocity, could not simply be allowed to continue his work unchallenged. Whatever the mixture of motives, the decision was made in late 1941. Operation Anthropoid would go forward. 2 men would be chosen, trained and dropped into the Protectorate to kill Reinhard Heydrich, and they would have to find a way to do it against all the odds that Nazi-occupied Europe could throw against them. The selection of the men who would carry out Operation Anthropoid was itself a careful process. The operation needed soldiers who were not only physically capable and trained for combat, but who possessed the psychological resilience to survive months of underground existence in an occupied country, living under false identities, dependent on a network of people who were themselves risking death by sheltering them. They needed to be able to function under extreme and prolonged stress, to maintain their cover, to make rapid decisions in dangerous situations, and, ultimately, to summon the nerve to carry out an attack on one of the most protected figures in Nazi Europe. The pool of candidates was the Czechoslovak army in exile, men who had escaped their country, made their way across Europe and sometimes through the Middle East, and were now training in Britain with a burning desire to do something, anything, that might help liberate their homeland. From this pool, two men were eventually chosen as the primary assassins, Józef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš. They were, in almost every way, products of their respective nations, and their differences complemented each other in ways that made the partnership work. The selection process was overseen by Colonel František Moravec, the chief of Czechoslovak military intelligence, a man who had himself pulled off one of the more extraordinary intelligence coups of the pre-war period, bringing his entire intelligence staff and their files out of Czechoslovakia on the morning of the Nazi invasion in March 1939. On the last plane before the borders were sealed, Moravec was not a sentimental man. He understood that the operation he was planning might well be fatal for those he sent to carry it out, and he made his selections accordingly. Men who were brave, competent, and psychologically capable of accepting that outcome. He was also working in close collaboration with the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, which had been established by Churchill in 1940 with the explicit mandate to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, assassination, and support for resistance movements across occupied Europe. The SOE would provide training, equipment, and the aircraft that would insert the Czechoslovak soldiers into the protectorate. Józef Gabčík was born on April 8, 1912, in Polovci, a small village in the region that is now Slovakia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and later the newly created Czechoslovakia. He came from modest circumstances, the son of a blacksmith, and his early life was shaped by the grinding, practical rhythms of rural Central European existence. He was not a product of the officer class or the educated elite. He was a working man, physically strong, practically minded, and possessed of the kind of direct, no-nonsense courage that comes not from theoretical heroism, but from a lifetime of hard physical experience. After completing his schooling, Gabčík worked as a locksmith and was called up for his compulsory military service in the Czechoslovak army in 1932. He took to military life with an aptitude that surprised even him, and when his initial service ended, he signed on as a regular soldier, eventually achieving the rank of staff sergeant and becoming a chemical weapons specialist, a training that would, ironically, prove of only marginal relevance to the mission he would ultimately undertake. When the Germans marched into Prague in March 1939 and the Czechoslovak state effectively ceased to exist, Gabčík was among the thousands of Czechoslovak soldiers who refused to accept occupation. He made his way out of the country, crossing into Poland, and when Poland too fell to Germany in September 1939, he continued west. He eventually reached France, where he joined the reconstituting Czechoslovak army. He fought with the Czechoslovak units during the desperate final weeks of the French campaign in 1940 and evacuated to Britain following France's fall, arriving at Liverpool with thousands of his fellow soldiers. In Britain, he continued his service, trained further, and eventually came to the attention of the intelligence officers who were building the pool of candidates for special operations parachute missions into occupied Europe. He was selected as one of several potential operatives for Operation Anthropoid, and ultimately as its primary assassin. He was 29 years old and had not seen his homeland in more than 2 years. Jan Kubiš was born on June 10, 1913, in Dolní Vilemovice, a village in Moravia, and his background was similarly working class and rural. His father worked as an agricultural labourer. Kubiš was slightly younger than Gabčík and had a somewhat different personality. Where Gabčík was direct and unsentimental, Kubiš was described by those who knew him as warm, sociable, and possessed of a quality of straightforward decency that made him easy to trust and easy to like. He had also served in the Czechoslovak army, and he had also found his way out of the country after the German occupation, through Poland and then through the Middle East, serving briefly with the French Foreign Legion before eventually making his way to Britain. His route out of occupied Europe had been more circuitous than Gabčík's and had taken longer, involving periods of considerable danger and uncertainty. By the time he arrived in Britain and joined the reconstituted Czechoslovak forces, he had already demonstrated the kind of resourcefulness and psychological durability that Moravec and his colleagues were looking for. He was selected to accompany Gabčík as the second assassin, the man who would carry the backup weapon, the Mills bomb grenade, in case the primary plan failed. The two men, along with other members of the various parachute groups being organised by Czechoslovak military intelligence and the SOE, trained together in Scotland at Arisaig House and other facilities in the Highlands through the autumn of 1941. The SOE training regime was comprehensive and physically demanding. The men were taught close-quarter combat, weapons handling for a variety of firearms, unarmed combat, tradecraft for maintaining cover identities, resistance to interrogation, signaling and wireless operation, and the specific techniques for carrying out attacks on protected targets. They practiced with the Steins submachine gun, which Gabčík would carry for the attack on Heydrich, and with the special anti-tank grenades that had been modified by a British engineer named Brigadier Colin Gubbins's team into the weapons Kubiš would ultimately use. These were not standard Mills bombs. They were adapted from a particular British-developed device and modified to produce a specific kind of shrapnel effect. The modification would prove both critically important and, in ways no one anticipated, a source of both salvation and tragedy. Throughout the training period, Gabčík and Kubiš were not told their precise target. The security protocols of the SOE were strict about compartmentalization. Operatives were told only what they needed to know for their immediate preparation. But the extensive briefings they received about conditions in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, the study of Prague's geography, the focus on the movements and habits of a very high-value target, all of it pointed clearly to something extraordinarily significant. By the time they were briefed on the actual mission, they had already, in psychological terms, prepared themselves for it. Kubiš reportedly expressed concern about the reprisals that would inevitably follow. He was not a man who lacked imagination about consequences, but he accepted the mission. They both did. On the night of December 28th to 29th, 1941, two Handley Page Halifax bombers of 138 Squadron, based at RAF Tangmere in Sussex, carried the Czechoslovak parachute groups on their drop missions over the Protectorate. Gabčík, Kubiš, and their fellow operative Jan Schuster were to be dropped in one aircraft over a drop zone near the village of Nevězdy, east of Prague. What actually happened was considerably messier. Navigation at night over blacked-out, snow-covered, occupied territory was extraordinarily difficult. The pilots had to contend with cloud cover, navigational uncertainty, and the ever-present danger of German anti-aircraft fire and night fighters. When the moment came to jump, Gabčík, Kubiš and Schuster found themselves dropping not near Nevězdy, but substantially to the southeast, into the countryside near Plzeň in western Bohemia, roughly 60 miles from their intended drop zone. They landed in deep snow, scattered across an unfamiliar landscape, in the middle of the night in a country under brutal Nazi occupation, with no immediate contacts, no shelter, and German troops theoretically everywhere. It was an inauspicious beginning to what was supposed to be a precisely planned operation. The men regrouped as best they could, buried their parachutes and equipment, and began the nerve-wracking process of establishing contact with the local Czech resistance. The underground network in the Protectorate, the organisation called UVOD, which stood for the Central Leadership of Home Resistance, was fragile and partially compromised by German security operations, but it was real and it was functioning. Over the weeks that followed, Gabčík, Kubiš and eventually Schuster made contact with resistance members who began the process of sheltering them, providing them with food, forged identity documents and safe houses. The courage of the Czech civilians who took these men in and kept them hidden cannot be overstated. Discovery meant torture and death, not just for themselves but for their families. Every person who offered a bed, a meal or a document was wagering everything they had on the proposition that resistance was worth dying for. The months between January and May 1942 were a period of extraordinary tension and tedium simultaneously. Gabčík and Kubiš moved between safe houses in Prague and the surrounding region, carefully studying the movements and routines of their target. Heydrich was a creature of habit in some ways. He drove regularly between his residence, Panenské Břežany Castle north of Prague, and his office at Hradčany Castle in the centre of the city. The route was largely fixed. The security arrangements were, by the standards of Nazi-occupied territory, surprisingly light. Heydrich's Mercedes, a dark green convertible, travelled the route with a single driver and Heydrich himself, sometimes accompanied by a second car with a modest escort, sometimes essentially alone. The lack of extensive security protection was noted and debated by the resistance. It seemed almost too easy. It was not, of course, easy at all, but the opportunity was there, and it was clearer than anyone had dared hope when the planning began in London. The question was where to strike. The route from Panenské Břežany to Prague passed through a number of locations, and the assassins and their contacts spent weeks evaluating each one, considering the sightlines, the escape routes, the likely speed of Heydrich's car at various points, the density of German security presence in the surrounding area, and the availability of cover and concealment for the attackers. They eventually settled on a sharp hairpin bend in the Holešovice district of northern Prague, near the junction of V. Holešovičkách and Zenklova streets. The bend was significant because it forced any vehicle travelling it to slow dramatically. A fast-moving, open-topped Mercedes negotiating a tight curve at speed would be moving slowly enough to offer a genuine window of opportunity. The area had reasonable cover, multiple potential escape routes, and was not so heavily patrolled as to make the approach and withdrawal impossible. It was, in the judgment of the men who had to stake their lives on the assessment, the best available option. They chose it, and they began to plan the execution of the attack in meticulous detail. By the spring of 1942, the broader situation in the Protectorate had become increasingly desperate. German security operations had intensified, and the underground network that sheltered the paratroopers was under mounting pressure. Several resistance figures known to Gabčík and Kubiš were arrested and killed. The circle of people who knew about their presence in the Protectorate was expanding as more helpers were required, and with each new person drawn into the secret, the risk of exposure grew. There was another factor pressing toward action. The intelligence reaching London suggested that Heydrich's position might be changing. There were reports that he was being considered for appointment to a different, even more senior role in the Nazi hierarchy, possibly as Reich Commissioner for Occupied France or in some other expanded capacity. If Heydrich left the Protectorate for Paris or another posting, the entire operation would have to be reformulated from scratch, and the long months of preparation would be wasted. Beneš and Moravec sent word from London. The operation should be carried out as soon as possible. May 1942 was identified as the window. Specifically, the target was May 27, 1942. The day had been chosen partly because of intelligence suggesting that Heydrich's schedule would bring him through the Holešovice bend at a predictable time, and partly because the window for the operation was closing. Whatever was going to happen had to happen soon, before the tightening net of German security caught the men who had been living underground for nearly 5 months. The morning of May 27th was approaching. Everything was in place, and the fate of Reinhard Heydrich and of a great many other people hung in the balance. To fully appreciate what Gabčík and Kubiš were about to attempt, it is worth pausing to consider the full weight of the task that had been placed on their shoulders. They were not professional assassins. They were soldiers turned agents, men trained to a high standard by one of the world's best clandestine services. But ultimately, human beings who had spent 5 months living in fear, dependent on others for their survival, cycling through the streets of a city where a single wrong word or an unexpected checkpoint could end everything in an interrogation cellar. They had watched the resistance network around them take casualties. They knew that the Gestapo's penetration of Czech underground organizations was deep and growing. They knew that the man they were targeting was surrounded, even if less heavily than one might expect, by some of the most ruthless security professionals in Europe. And they knew with complete clarity that the probability of surviving their mission was somewhere between very small and non-existent. The Germans would not rest until the assassins were found. Both men understood this, and both men committed to the mission anyway. The network that supported Gabčík and Kubiš during their months underground was extraordinary in its breadth and its courage. Among the most important of their helpers was a family in Prague, who provided the two men with one of their most secure and important safe houses. The Moravec family, consisting of Alois Moravec, his wife Marie, and their son Arta, who lived at Biskupkova Street in the Žižkov district of Prague. The family had been drawn into resistance work through connections in the Czech underground, and they had been sheltering not just Gabčík and Kubiš, but other members of the various parachute groups that had been inserted into the Protectorate by the Czechoslovak exile government. Their apartments served as a meeting point, a communications hub, and a refuge. Marie Moravec, in particular, was a woman of remarkable courage. She managed the household, maintained the cover stories, and kept her composure under conditions of almost unimaginable stress. She knew exactly what she was doing and what it would mean if she was caught. She did it anyway. There was also the Zelenka-Hajsky family, Jan Zelenka being a physical education teacher who became one of the key organizers of support for the parachute groups and who moved the men between safe houses, arranged their forged documents, and served as one of the crucial human links between the London-trained operatives and the domestic resistance. Zelenka had what one might call the perfect personality for this kind of work: calm, methodical, with an instinctive understanding of operational security and a gift for assessing trustworthiness in others. He was the kind of man on whom an entire operation depended, and he delivered again and again through months of mounting danger. The Czech Orthodox Church, specifically the Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius on Reslova Street in the New Town district of Prague, also played a crucial role in sheltering the paratroopers, and its bishop, Gorazd Matej Pavlik, made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life, but that has since secured his place in Czech national memory as one of the great heroes of the resistance. Bishop Gorazd was not a young man, and he was not someone who had made the decision to involve his cathedral in clandestine resistance work lightly. He understood the risks with complete clarity, but he authorized the use of the cathedral's crypt and its various underground spaces as a shelter for the parachute groups, and when the critical moment came, he refused to abandon them. His decision, and the faith it embodied in something larger than personal safety, would have consequences that shook the entire protectorate. The group of parachutists who had dropped into the protectorate in late December 1941 was not limited to Gabčík and Kubiš. Several other groups had been inserted in the same period, and the weeks following, each with different missions, and the men of these groups overlapped in their use of the resistance network's resources. Among those who would eventually share the cathedral crypt were Adolf Opalka, the leader of a group called Outdistance, whose mission was related to communications and intelligence work, Josef Bublik and Jan Hruby, members of the Tin Group, František Valčík, a member of the Silver A Group who had come to Prague after his original mission was compromised, and Josef Schwarz, another parachutist. These 7 men, along with Gabčík and Kubiš, would ultimately find themselves together at the cathedral in the terrible days following the attack, bound by shared fate and shared commitment. But all of that was still ahead. In the early months of 1942, they were moving through the city as ghosts, unseen and undetected, preparing for a moment that most of them knew would be their last. The preparations for the attack were detailed and careful. Gabčík and Kubiš visited the Holešovič Bend multiple times, at different times of day and in different weather conditions, timing the traffic, observing the patterns of police patrols, identifying the positions from which they would launch the attack, and the routes by which they would attempt to escape. They had assistance from several members of the resistance who served as lookouts and scouts, and from Adolf Opalka, who was designated to play a supporting role in the attack itself, positioned at a point near the bend to provide warning of Heydrich's approach and potentially to offer covering fire or create a distraction if needed. The plan that emerged was simple in its outline and enormously complex in its execution. Gabčík would stand at the bend with the Steen gun concealed under his coat. When Heydrich's Mercedes slowed for the curve, Gabčík would step forward and open fire. Kubiš would be positioned slightly further along the road, and if Gabčík's attack failed or was incomplete, Kubiš would throw his modified anti-tank grenade. They were also equipped with handguns as final backup, and each man carried a cyanide capsule. There was no illusion about what capture would mean. The specific timing of the attack had been influenced by intelligence suggesting that Heydrich was planning to fly to Berlin on the afternoon of May 27th for a meeting with Hitler. If this was true, it meant that his car would definitely pass through Holešovice on the morning of that day at roughly the time that his usual schedule would predict. The intelligence was accurate in its broad outlines. Heydrich's appointment with Hitler was real, and it would have been his last journey to Berlin before what appears to have been a scheduled handover of some of his protectorate responsibilities, possibly related to a broader role elsewhere in the Nazi Empire. The precise details of what Berlin had planned for Heydrich remain a matter of historical debate, but the key fact for the assassins was that, on the morning of May 27, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich would be in his car on his usual route at a predictable time. They had their moment. Now they had to find the nerve to use it. The night before the attack, Gabčík and Kubiš were sheltered with Czech helpers, going through the final preparations. They checked their weapons repeatedly. The Sten gun was a weapon that had acquired a somewhat mixed reputation in SOE operations. It was cheap to manufacture, reliable in many conditions, and compact enough to be concealed under a coat, but it was also known to jam, particularly if the magazine was handled incorrectly or if the weapon had been stored in unfavorable conditions. They cleaned and tested it as thoroughly as they could under the circumstances. The modified grenades that Kubiš would carry were also checked. These devices, essentially a British No. 73 anti-tank grenade modified by an SOE engineer to produce a specific kind of fragmentation effect, had been designed and manufactured specifically for this operation by a British officer who had worked to produce a weapon that would reliably disable a vehicle even if the thrower's accuracy was imperfect. They were small, relatively easy to conceal, and should, in theory, have been devastatingly effective. In practice, as the morning of May 27th would demonstrate, the reality was both better and worse than the theory, in ways that no one could have predicted. The morning of May 27th, 1942, began quietly. Prague in the spring is beautiful, the city of Kafka and Mozart, its Baroque spires and medieval towers, softened by the light of a mild European morning. The trams ran, the shopkeepers opened their stores, German soldiers moved through the streets with the practiced casualness of an army fully in control of its territory. There was nothing from the outside to mark this day as different from any other day of the occupation. But at the Holoshovich Bend, in the early morning hours, the men of Operation Anthropoid were taking up their positions. Gabčík cycled to the bend and positioned himself on the pavement, his Sten gun concealed under a briefcase and raincoat. Kubiš took up his position a little further along the route, his grenades in a briefcase. Valčík was positioned further back up the route to serve as the early warning lookout, with a small mirror that he would use to signal the approach of Heydrich's car. Opalka took a position in the vicinity to provide additional observation and support. The morning passed slowly. Heydrich's car was expected at approximately 10:30. In the morning, based on the typical timing of his departure from Panenské Břežany. As the time approached and then passed, the tension at the bend became almost physically unbearable. Every passing vehicle required the men to be ready to react, to determine instantly whether this was the target, whether now was the moment. Every German patrol that passed nearby had to be endured without visible reaction. The minutes stretched, and then, shortly before 10:30, Valčík's signal came, a flash of reflected sunlight from the mirror. Heydrich's car was approaching. The Mercedes convertible came around the upper part of the hairpin curve, descending toward the bend. Heydrich was in the rear seat, in his SS uniform, accompanied by his driver, SS Oberscharführer Johannes Klein. The car was travelling at moderate speed, appropriate for the approach to a tight bend. This was the moment. Gabčík stepped off the pavement into the road and threw back his coat and raised the Sten gun and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The Sten gun had jammed. Whether it was a magazine fault, a stovepipe jam, or some other mechanical failure has been debated ever since. But the immediate reality was unambiguous. The primary weapon of the primary assassin had failed at the critical moment, and Reinhard Heydrich was sitting in his car approximately 10 meters away, alive, uninjured, and staring at the man who had just tried to kill him. What happened next has become one of the most analysed moments in the history of the Second World War, because Heydrich made a decision that was either astonishingly brave or catastrophically stupid, depending on your perspective. And it was almost certainly both. Instead of ordering his driver to accelerate through and away from the ambush, which a man with normal survival instincts and any significant personal security training would immediately have done, Heydrich ordered the car to stop. He stood up in the rear seat and drew his pistol, apparently intending to confront and capture or kill his attacker. It was an act of extraordinary personal courage and of extraordinary tactical foolishness. By stopping the car, he gave Kubiš exactly what he needed: a stationary target at close range with time to act. Kubiš ran forward and threw one of his modified grenades, but the throw was not perfect. The grenade did not land inside the car as intended. It hit the rear of the vehicle and exploded against the wheel arch and bodywork. The blast was powerful. It destroyed part of the rear of the car, shattered glass, and sent shrapnel and fragments of the vehicle's bodywork outward in all directions. The driver, Klein, was temporarily incapacitated. Heydrich was struck by multiple fragments and pieces of material from the car's upholstery and bodywork. Kubiš himself was hit by some of the grenade's shrapnel and briefly dazed. And then the chaos of the immediate aftermath took over. Heydrich, incredibly, got out of the damaged car. He was bleeding and clearly injured, but he was standing and he was still holding his pistol, and he was firing at his attackers as they attempted to escape. It seemed, in those terrifying seconds, as though the assassination had failed. The target was alive, on his feet, shooting. The primary weapon had jammed. The grenade had done damage but had not killed. Had the most carefully planned, most consequential political assassination in the history of the Nazi Empire just failed on the pavement of a Prague street? Heydrich pursued Gabčík on foot for a short distance, firing his pistol before collapsing against a nearby building. He had lost more blood than his upright posture suggested, and the exertion of running and firing proved too much for a body that had just absorbed the blast effects of a grenade. A Czech woman, unconnected to the resistance, flagged down a passing van and, in the confusion of the moment, Heydrich was loaded onto it and driven toward the Bulovka hospital. Gabčík had fled on foot, and after a desperate chase through the streets of Holešovice in which he shot and wounded a Gestapo officer who pursued him, escaped. Kubiš had also managed to get clear of the scene, mounting his bicycle and riding away through the confused immediate aftermath of the explosion. The lookouts and other support personnel had dispersed. Within minutes of the attack, the perpetrators were gone, and Reinhard Heydrich was in a vehicle being driven to a hospital, bleeding from multiple wounds, his condition uncertain, but not yet obviously mortal. The initial German response to news of the attack was one of near panic, and this is not an exaggeration. The shooting of the acting Reich protector in his own car on a public street in the middle of a major occupied city in broad daylight was not merely an attack on one man. It was a declaration that Nazi control of the protectorate was not as absolute as it appeared. It was a demonstration that the resistance could reach anyone, anywhere, regardless of their status or their security arrangements. The psychological impact on the German security apparatus in Prague was severe. Within hours, the city was effectively locked down. Roadblocks went up throughout the protectorate. A curfew was imposed. The Gestapo and SD launched an immediate and massive manhunt, with Heydrich's deputy Karl Hermann Frank, a Sudeten German who was among the most fanatical of the Nazi officials in the protectorate, coordinating the response with barely contained fury. Karl Hermann Frank announced immediately a reward of 10 million Czech crowns, an enormous sum, for information leading to the capture of the assassins. He also threatened mass reprisals if the perpetrators were not found quickly. Hundreds of Czechs were arrested in the hours and days immediately following the attack, dragged in for interrogation based on little more than geographical proximity or prior suspicion. The Gestapo worked through its networks and informers with ruthless efficiency. And yet, in those initial hours and days, Gabčík and Kubiš and their companions had vanished back into the underground network that had sheltered them for months. The Gestapo, for all its power, was chasing ghosts in a city of nearly 1 million people. At the Bulovka hospital, the scene was tense with a different kind of urgency. Heydrich was receiving medical attention for his wounds, which were more extensive than the external examination had initially suggested. He had sustained injuries to his left side and back from shrapnel fragments and, critically, from material that had been blasted inward from the car's bodywork. Upholstery fabric, horsehair stuffing, and metal fragments had been driven into his body cavity. The presence of these non-sterile foreign materials inside the wound was the key medical concern. In the age before widespread antibiotics, the risk of sepsis from contaminated wounds was severe, and Heydrich's injuries, while not immediately life-threatening in the sense of massive blood loss or organ damage, carried a very high probability of leading to severe infection, if not properly managed. Heydrich underwent surgery at Bulovka Hospital. A Czech surgical team operated on him, and the initial surgery appeared to go as well as could be hoped. His spleen was partly removed, fragments were extracted from his wounds, and he was stabilized. Himmler sent his own personal physician, SS Gruppenführer Karl Gebhardt, to oversee Heydrich's care. Gebhardt was a trained surgeon and a close personal friend of Himmler's from their shared youth in the early years of the Nazi movement. His involvement in Heydrich's treatment has been the subject of considerable historical debate, because Gebhardt made the controversial decision not to administer sulfonamide antibiotics, which were available and which the responsible treating physicians recommended. Whether this was simple medical conservatism and more error of judgment or something more sinister has never been definitively established. Gebhardt himself would later claim it was a straightforward medical decision. Others have suggested that the absence of sulfonamides may have been more deliberate, though the evidence for such a theory remains circumstantial. What is not in dispute is that the decision not to use available antibiotics contributed materially to what happened next. In the immediate aftermath of the surgery, Heydrich's condition appeared to be improving. He was conscious, he was communicating with Himmler, who visited him in the hospital, and with his wife Lena, who was summoned from Panenské Břežany. Himmler reported to Hitler that Heydrich would recover. The Nazi leadership exhaled. The propaganda machine had already gone to work, describing the attack as a cowardly assassination attempt organised by Benesch and his paymasters in London, part of a broader Allied conspiracy against the German leadership. The language used was designed to project strength and outrage. This had been an attack not just on Heydrich but on the German Reich itself, and the perpetrators would be found and destroyed, along with all who had helped them. But beneath the confident propaganda, within the inner circles of the SS and the Nazi leadership, there was genuine anxiety about Heydrich's condition. He had been struck by something that the Germans, with their formidable intelligence apparatus, still did not fully understand. They did not know yet exactly what kind of weapon had been used, or who had made it, or what exactly had been blasted into Heydrich's body along with the shrapnel. The answer to that last question was unfolding in Heydrich's bloodstream. The infections that the Czech physicians and some of Gebhardt's junior colleagues had feared were developing. In the days following the surgery, Heydrich's condition began to deteriorate. Fever climbed. He became delirious at points. His body was fighting. Septicemia, blood poisoning originating from the contaminated material that had been driven into his wounds, and that even the surgery had not entirely removed. The powerful young man who had ridden his open-topped Mercedes through Prague as a demonstration of invulnerability was lying in a hospital bed, losing a battle that none of his power, none of his intelligence, and none of his ruthlessness could help him win. The bacteria did not know he was Reinhard Heydrich. The infection did not care about his rank or his relationship with Hitler or his place in the hierarchy of the SS. It simply did what infections do, and it was winning. On June 3, 1942, Heydrich fell into a coma. He never recovered consciousness. On June 4, 1942, at 4:30 in the morning, 8 days after he had been struck by Kubisch's grenade on the hairpin bend in Holešovice, Reinhard Heydrich died. He was 38 years old, the operational director of the Holocaust, the man who had chaired the Wannsee Conference and built the machinery of the final solution, the man Hitler called the man with the iron heart, was dead. Operation Anthropoid had succeeded. The news of Heydrich's death was received within the Nazi leadership with a mixture of genuine grief, political anxiety, and institutional calculation. Hitler was reported to be deeply shaken. He had regarded Heydrich as one of the most capable individuals in the entire Nazi empire, and the loss was not merely personal but strategic. Himmler was devastated in a way that went beyond politics. He had known Heydrich for more than a decade. He had created him, in a sense, by giving the young, dismissed naval officer the opportunity to build the SD, and he had shaped his career at every step. Now the instrument he had built and wielded was gone, and the manner of its going was profoundly disturbing. Assassinated in broad daylight by operatives of the exile government, in the heart of what was supposed to be a fully controlled, occupied territory. The implications for the security of every senior Nazi official were obvious and terrifying. The state funeral for Heydrich was orchestrated with the full theatrical weight of the Nazi regime. His body lay in state in Prague Castle, draped in swastika flags with an SS honor guard. Then it was transported by rail to Berlin, where a ceremony was held in the Reich Chancellery with Hitler in attendance, and Heydrich was interred in the Invalidenfriedhof cemetery. Himmler gave the main eulogy, in which he described Heydrich as a martyr of the German nation, and promised that his death would not go unavenged. He was, in the language of Nazi propaganda, transformed in death into a symbol. The perfect SS man, the ideal of hardness and devotion, the fallen warrior whose murder demanded retribution on a scale that would deter any further such attacks and punish the population whose complicity had made the assassination possible. The word retribution is important here because it is one of the most inadequate words in the language for describing what the Nazi regime actually did in the days and weeks following Heydrich's death. What followed was not retribution in any moral sense. It was collective punishment of an entire civilian population on a scale that, even within the long and terrible history of Nazi occupation policy, stood out for its deliberate, comprehensive, and calculated brutality. And at the centre of that brutality was a small village in the Czech countryside, whose name would, within weeks, become known across the entire Allied world as a synonym for Nazi barbarism, Lidis. The connection between Lidis and the assassination of Heydrich was tenuous to the point of being essentially non-existent, which makes the horror of what happened there all the more profound. Lidis was a mining village of approximately 500 inhabitants, located about 22 kilometers northwest of Prague in the Kladno district. It had been identified by the Gestapo before the assassination as a village with possible connections to resistance activities, primarily because a family named Horak had a son serving with the Czechoslovak forces in Britain. There were also letters intercepted from a Czech man working in Germany that mentioned Lidis in a way the Gestapo found interesting, though the actual evidence of specific involvement by Lidis residents in any resistance activities was thin to the point of absence. But in the frenzied aftermath of Heydrich's death, with Karl Hermann Frank and the Gestapo under enormous pressure from Berlin to demonstrate both the seriousness of the German response and their capability to identify those responsible, Lidis was seized upon as a target. The decision to destroy it was made at the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy, almost certainly with Hitler's direct approval or direction. The rationale, such as it was, centered on the alleged connections between the village and the Czechoslovak exile. Forces in Britain, combined with the general principle, long established in Nazi occupation policy, of holding entire communities responsible for the actions of individuals among them. And on the night of June 9th to 10th, 1942, German security forces surrounded Lidis. What followed was one of the most methodically documented atrocities of the entire Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. The male inhabitants of the village, 173 men and boys aged 15 and over, were assembled in a farmyard. They were shot. Some were lined up against the wall of the farm's barn and executed in groups. The process was cold, bureaucratic, and utterly systematic. Each group of victims was led out, shot, and the next group brought forward. A total of 173 men and boys were murdered in Lidis that morning. The women of the village, 184 of them, were transported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where they were subjected to forced labour and the systematic brutalities of the concentration camp system. Many of them would not survive the war. The children of Lidis, 88 of them, were taken away separately. Of these, the overwhelming majority were sent to the Chelmno death camp in occupied Poland and murdered with carbon monoxide gas. A handful, selected by Nazi racial criteria as sufficiently Aryan in appearance, were removed for Germanization, placed with German families, and their identities erased. The physical destruction of Lidis was equally total and equally methodical. Every building in the village was burned. The rubble was bulldozed and the earth levelled. The cemetery was exhumed and the bodies removed. The river Lidicki Potok, which ran through the village, was diverted. Within a few weeks there was literally nothing left. No building, no wall, no gravestone, nothing that would indicate that a village called Lidis had ever existed on that ground. The Nazis went so far as to attempt to remove the name Lidis from all maps and official records. It was annihilation not just of the living inhabitants, but of the very memory of the place. It was, in the terminology of later genocide scholarship, an act of memoricide as well as of murder. The village of Ležáky met a similar fate. Ležáky was a small hamlet in the Pardubice region, home to approximately 33 adults, and it had been identified as a location where a resistance wireless set for one of the parachute groups had been hidden. On June 24, 1942, German security forces arrived in Ležáky. The adult residents were shot. The children were taken and, following the same process as Lidis, either murdered or placed for Germanization. The village was destroyed. By any measure of the scale of violence applied to the civilian population, the actions against Lidis and Ležáky were the most extreme reprisals carried out by the Nazi regime in Western or Central Europe during the entire war. They were not aberrations. They were deliberate policy decisions made by senior Nazi officials and approved at the highest level of the regime. But the reprisals did not stop there. In the weeks following Heydrich's death, the Gestapo's operations against the broader Czech population, and specifically against anyone with any possible connection to resistance activities, were expanded dramatically. The number of Czechs executed for alleged resistance activities or complicity in the assassination rose into the hundreds. Entire networks that had taken years to build were rolled up. The underground organizations that had supported the parachute groups were decimated. Czech society, already living under terror, was subjected to a further tightening of occupation pressure that would last for the remainder of the war. And yet, through all of this, Gabčík, Kubiš and their comrades in the crypt of the Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius were still alive and still undetected. The cathedral, under the leadership of Bishop Gorazd, had become their final refuge. The crypt, accessible through a concealed entrance in the cathedral's nave, was an extraordinary space, a series of underground chambers originally designed for burial purposes, with thick stone walls, multiple chambers, and access to a narrow air shaft that would later prove critically important. The 7 paratroopers lived in these underground chambers, dependent on supplies brought in by the cathedral's clergy and a small number of trusted helpers. They slept on makeshift beds, they ate what was brought to them. They waited and listened as the sounds of the increasingly frantic German manhunt filtered through the stone walls above them. The information about where they were hiding was known only to a very small number of people. The security around the cathedral was as tight as the small, exhausted resistance network could manage. Bishop Gorazd himself kept the circle of those with knowledge of the paratroopers' presence to an absolute minimum. The cathedral's priests and support staff were carefully managed. The supplies brought in were disguised as routine maintenance or religious materials. For weeks, the concealment held. The Gestapo's massive manhunt, with its roadblocks, its interrogations, its rewards and threats, failed to locate 7 men hiding in a crypt beneath a cathedral in the centre of Prague. It was a remarkable achievement of concealment and of human loyalty under extraordinary pressure. But every system of concealment, no matter how carefully constructed, has vulnerabilities. And the vulnerability in this case was not a physical one, but a human one. The possibility that someone somewhere in the network of people who knew or suspected where the men were hidden would break under pressure. The Gestapo understood this. Their interrogation methods were designed precisely to find the point at which any human being could be made to speak, and they applied those methods systematically, and without mercy to the hundreds of Czechs they arrested in the weeks following the assassination. The question was not whether anyone would break, but when and who. The answer came in late June 1942 in the form of Karol Czurda, and his name has been synonymous in the Czech historical memory with treachery ever since. Czurda was himself a member of the parachute groups that had been dropped into the Protectorate in late 1941 and early 1942. He had been part of a group designated Outdistance, one of several mission groups inserted alongside Anthropoid. He had not been directly involved in the assassination itself, but he knew, through his participation in the underground network, a great deal about the people and the places that had supported the parachutists. He knew names, he knew addresses, he knew, or could reason out from what he knew, where the men who had killed Heydrich were likely to be sheltering. In the last days of June 1942, as the German reprisals intensified, and the terror of the occupation reached a new pitch, Czurda made a decision that has defied easy psychological explanation ever since. He walked into Gestapo headquarters in Prague and informed on his comrades. The immediate trigger appears to have been a combination of fear and the lure of the enormous reward that had been offered for information leading to the assassins. He gave the Gestapo the names of several families who had sheltered the parachutists, including the Moravec family on Biskupkova Street. He provided addresses, he provided details that allowed the Gestapo within hours to arrest people who had no warning and no chance of escape. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. At the Moravec apartment, the arrest came in the early morning. Alois Moravec was not home, his wife Marie was. According to the account that has been reconstructed from various sources, including the testimony of survivors and German records, Marie Moravec understood immediately what was happening. She managed to take a cyanide capsule hidden in her ring rather than be taken alive. She died before she could be interrogated. Her son, Atta, however, was arrested and taken to Gestapo headquarters. He was young, he was terrified, and after prolonged and evidently severe interrogation, he provided information about the hiding places used by the paratroopers. Most critically, he is believed to have revealed or confirmed the location of the cathedral crypt. The Gestapo moved with the efficiency that made them so feared. By the early morning hours of June 18, 1942, they had assembled a force of approximately 800 Waffen-SS soldiers and security police around the Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius on Reslova Street. The cathedral was surrounded before dawn, its every exit covered. The force assembled against 7 exhausted men in a crypt was overwhelming, and deliberately so. The Germans were taking no chances of another escape. At approximately 4 in the morning, the assault began. The Battle of the Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius on June 18, 1942, was one of the most extraordinary and unequal last stands of the entire Second World War. 7 men, armed with pistols, a few submachine guns, and a limited supply of ammunition against the full weight of 800 German soldiers surrounding a stone building in the centre of an occupied capital city. There was no possibility of escape, no prospect of rescue, and no outcome except death. The men in the crypt knew this. They had known it, in all probability, from the moment the Anthropoid mission was first explained to them. They had accepted it then, and they accepted it now. What they would not accept was capture. The assault began with an attempt to take the nave of the cathedral, where 3 of the 7 paratroopers, Adolf Opalka, Jan Kubisch, and Josef Bublek, had positioned themselves in the gallery above the main floor. The Germans entered through the main doors of the cathedral and immediately came under fire. Opalka, Kubisch, and Bublek fought with what they had, and the narrow confines of the cathedral's interior gave them some advantage. The Germans could not easily deploy their superior numbers in the confined space of the nave. The fighting in the gallery was intense. German SS soldiers fell. The 3 paratroopers fighting from behind the pillars and pews of the gallery held the attacking force at bay for a considerable time. But the mathematics of the situation were absolute. Against 800 men with effectively unlimited ammunition, 3 men with pistols and a handful of magazine loads could have only one possible ending. Jan Kubisch, the man who had thrown the grenade that mortally wounded Reinhard Heydrich less than a month earlier, was mortally wounded in the fighting in the cathedral gallery. The precise circumstances of how he received his fatal wounds are not entirely clear from the surviving accounts, but it is established that he was critically wounded during the battle in the nave. He died in the cathedral, his blood running across the stone floor of a city he had come back to liberate. He was 29 years old. Josef Bublek also died in the fighting in the nave. Adolf Opalka, also fatally wounded, died in the cathedral. The fighting in the upper portion of the building was over. This left 4 men in the crypt: Josef Gabčík, Jan Hruby, Josef Schwarz, and František Valčík. They had heard the sounds of the battle above them, the gunfire, the German commands, the explosions, and they had used the time to prepare their final position as best they could. The crypt was accessed by a narrow staircase from the cathedral nave, and the entrance to the crypt could be partially barricaded. The walls were solid stone, centuries old and impervious to small arms fire. The space was cramped and dark. The air was thick. The men had limited ammunition, limited water, and no food. What they had was a determination that cannot be adequately expressed in any language. The specific, conscious, considered determination of men who have decided that they will die on their own terms and that every additional minute they can hold their position is a minute of defiance against an empire that has murdered their people, destroyed their country, and broken the world. The Germans attempted to enter the crypt through the staircase and were met by fire from the men below. The narrow staircase channeled the attackers into a killing ground where the defenders' fire was devastating, despite the disparity in numbers. Several German soldiers were killed or wounded attempting to force the staircase. The Germans pulled back and considered their options. They tried flooding the crypt through the ventilation shaft with fire hoses, pumping water into the underground chamber to drown the defenders or force them out. The water began rising in the crypt. Still, the men held. They traded fire with any German who appeared in the staircase opening. They called up to the Germans, according to the accounts of survivors among the German forces, in Czech and German, maintaining a defiant, controlled communication with their attackers that gave nothing and demanded nothing except that the end, when it came, come on their own terms. The bishop of the cathedral, Gorazd, appeared before the entrance to the cathedral during the battle and offered himself to the German commander as a hostage and intermediary, attempting to negotiate some resolution that might allow the paratroopers to surrender without immediate execution. The German commander, who had his orders from Berlin, rejected this entirely. Bishop Gorazd was arrested on the spot. He would be tried, convicted, and executed on September 4th, 1942, along with several other members of the cathedral's clergy. The vicar bishop, Vladimir Petrek, the senior deacon, Václav Číkl, and others who had knowingly sheltered the paratroopers. Their execution represented the full weight of the Nazi regime's vengeance against those who had helped protect the men who killed Heydrich, and the Orthodox Church of the Czech lands regards Bishop Gorazd and his colleagues as martyrs and saints. The Serbian Orthodox Church canonized Gorazd in 1961, and the Czech Orthodox Church followed with its own formal recognition. His memory is honored in the Czech Republic to this day. In the crypt, with water rising and ammunition running low and the sounds of German soldiers above and around them, the 4 surviving paratroopers made their final choice. At some point in the last hour of the battle, each of the men used his last round on himself. The exact sequence is not entirely clear from the surviving German records, but the outcome is, when German soldiers finally forced their way into the flooded crypt, they found 4 dead men. Josef Gabčík was among them, the man who had stepped into the road at the Holešovec bend with a Steen gun under. His coat, whose weapon had jammed at the crucial moment, who had fled through the streets and evaded the entire apparatus of Gestapo pursuit for 3 weeks, was dead at 30 years old by his own hand, in a flooded crypt beneath a cathedral in the city he had come to liberate. He had not been captured. He had not given them anything. He had done what he came to do, and then he had died, as he chose. The aftermath of the battle was documented by the Germans with characteristic thoroughness. The bodies of the 7 paratroopers were photographed and their identities established. Reports went to Berlin. The cathedral itself was confiscated from the Czech Orthodox Church, which was dissolved as a religious body. The clergy who had harboured the paratroopers were executed. The families of the men were tracked down where possible and subjected to punishment. The entire apparatus of Nazi retribution machinery was applied with maximum force to everyone and everything connected to the operation, and still it was not enough to undo what had been done on the morning of May 27, 1942. The broader reprisals that followed Heydrich's death and the final accounting with the paratroopers need to be understood in their full scope to appreciate the cost of Operation Anthropoid. According to the most careful historical estimates, the German reprisals following the assassination resulted in the deaths of approximately 1,300 Czechs, killed in the immediate manhunt, executed in the aftermath, or murdered in the destruction of Lidice and Ležáky. A further 3,000 Jews living in the Protectorate were deported to death camps in a specific, additional reprisal deportation ordered in the immediate wake of the assassination. The women of Lidice suffered for years in Ravensbrück. The children of Lidice were murdered. The resistance networks that had been built with enormous patience and courage over years of occupation were largely destroyed. The Czech underground would take years to recover to anything approaching its previous effectiveness. Karel Čurda, the man whose betrayal had made the final reckoning possible, did not face his own reckoning until after the war. The Gestapo rewarded him substantially, reportedly with a payment equivalent to several million Czech crowns, and he spent the remainder of the war living under a German identity with a wife and eventually a child, in a life made possible entirely by the deaths of his comrades and the destruction of the families who had sheltered them. In 1947, after the liberation of Czechoslovakia, he was arrested, tried for treason and collaboration, convicted and executed by hanging on April 29, 1947. He was 35 years old. Asked at his trial why he had betrayed his comrades, he reportedly said, "You would have done the same for 1,000,000 marks." It was the kind of answer that explained nothing and revealed everything about the choice he had made. The historical debate about whether Operation Anthropoid was worth it, whether the assassination of Heydrich justified the enormous human cost of the reprisals, has continued for more than 80 years and shows no sign of resolution. It is, in some ways, the wrong question, because it presupposes a calculation that the people who made the decisions in 1941 and 1942 could not make with the information available to them. The men and women who planned Operation Anthropoid, who carried it out and who sheltered the paratroopers at the cost of their own lives, were operating in a world of incomplete information, intense moral pressure, and no good options. They made the best decisions they could in conditions that were unimaginably difficult, and they did so with a courage that demands respect regardless of one's final assessment of the strategic calculus. But the question of strategic impact is worth examining carefully, because one of the persistent claims about Operation Anthropoid is that Heydrich's death had no significant effect on the Holocaust or on the broader Nazi war effort, and that therefore the enormous cost in Czech civilian lives was essentially pointless. This claim is considerably more complicated than it first appears. Heydrich was not simply interchangeable with any other senior Nazi official, he was the operational director of the final solution, the man who had built the administrative machinery of genocide and who possessed an intimate, detailed working knowledge of how that machinery functioned that was genuinely irreplaceable. His successor as head of the Reich Security Main Office, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, was competent, but by no means the same caliber of administrative intelligence that Heydrich represented. The Holocaust continued, and continued with terrible efficiency after Heydrich's death, but the organizational capacity that Heydrich himself embodied was not seamlessly transferred to another. Moreover, the impact of Heydrich's death on the broader international perception of the Czech resistance was immediate and significant. The assassination was a demonstration on the largest possible stage that the Czechoslovak government in exile was a real fighting force, not simply a government in name only. It contributed directly to the British government's subsequent willingness to repudiate the Munich Agreement of 1938, the document that had consigned Czechoslovakia to German domination and that Beneš had always maintained was legally invalid. In August 1942, just weeks after the assassination and its aftermath had played out on the world's front pages, the British Foreign Secretary formally informed Beneš that Britain considered the Munich Agreement void. This had profound implications for the post-war settlement. It meant that the Czechoslovak borders of 1937 would be recognized as the basis for the post-war state, and it laid the legal and political groundwork for the eventual expulsion of the Sudeten Germans that would follow the war's end. Operation Anthropoid, in other words, had diplomatic consequences that shaped the post-war map of Central Europe. The attack also genuinely and measurably frightened the Nazi leadership. The killing of Heydrich was a demonstration that no one was safe, and it resulted in immediate and significant changes to the personal security arrangements of senior Nazi officials across occupied Europe. Hitler himself, already notoriously security conscious, became even more so after Heydrich's death. Himmler rarely appeared in public in the months following the assassination. Other senior SS and party leaders significantly increased their security details and became more cautious in their movements. The psychological impact of demonstrating that the highest ranks of the Nazi hierarchy could be reached and killed by Allied trained operatives was not trivial. It constrained how those officials operated and moved for the remainder of the war, the story of what happened to the places and people. Connected to Operation Anthropoid in the decades after the war is a story of memorialization, justice, and the long, complex process of a nation coming to terms with one of the defining moments of its history. In Czechoslovakia, after the liberation in 1945, the memory of the assassins and their helpers was honored almost immediately. Streets were named for Gabčík and Kubiš. The cathedral became a memorial site. The families of those who had sheltered the paratroopers were celebrated as resistance heroes. The name Lidis, which the Nazis had attempted to erase from the map, was not only restored but became globally famous. Communities around the world, in Britain, in the United States, in Latin America and elsewhere, symbolically adopted the name Lidis or renamed streets after it as acts of solidarity. The Lidis Memorial was established at the site of the destroyed village. A new village, Nova Lidis, was built nearby, and the survivors who returned from Ravensbrück and other camps began the painful work of rebuilding what could be rebuilt. The memorial site at the Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague remains one of the most visited historical sites in the Czech Republic to this day. The bullet holes from the 1942 battle are preserved in the walls of the crypt. The narrow air shaft through which the Germans pumped water is still visible. The memorial plaques listing the names of the paratroopers and the clergy who sheltered them line the walls. The atmosphere of the place is unlike almost anywhere else associated with the Second World War. It has a quality of profound, quiet weight that comes from knowing exactly what happened there, knowing it in the most concrete and specific possible way, in a space where the evidence of those last hours is written in the stone around you. The film record of Operation Anthropoid has been substantial. Several films have attempted to tell the story, with varying degrees of historical accuracy and cinematic ambition. Anthropoid, released in 2016 and starring Cillian Murphy as Gabčík and Jamie Dornan as Kubiš, was one of the more serious and historically grounded attempts, filming extensively in Prague and working from carefully researched historical sources. HHHH, a novel by French author Laurent Binet, published in 2010, became an international literary success and was also adapted for film as The Man with the Iron Heart in 2017. These works, together with an extensive Czech and international historical literature, have kept the story of Operation Anthropoid alive and accessible to successive generations in a way that many resistance operations of the Second World War have not been. The story has a quality of narrative completeness and moral clarity, even in its moral complexity, that makes it profoundly compelling to anyone who encounters it. What does it mean to say that Operation Anthropoid was the most important assassination of the Second World War? The claim is worth examining carefully because history offers other contenders. The various plots against Hitler, most notably the July 20th, 1944, plot that came closer to success than any other, involved the potential killing of a far more powerful figure. The assassination of Admiral Darlan in Algiers in December 1942, while less well known, had significant immediate political consequences for the Allied position in North Africa. Other operations targeted figures of considerable importance. So why Heydrich? The answer lies in the specific combination of factors that made his death uniquely consequential. Heydrich was not merely one senior official among many, he was, at the moment of his death, the single human being most directly responsible for the operational functioning of the Holocaust. He had built the system, he knew its every mechanism, and his absence created a discontinuity in the management of mass murder that, however terrible the things that followed, was genuinely significant. He was also uniquely positioned in the Nazi power structure in a way that made him, in the judgment of many historians, one of the most likely eventual successors to either Himmler or possibly Hitler himself. Several historians have noted that Heydrich possessed a combination of intelligence, ambition, administrative capability, and ruthlessness that made him potentially more dangerous than almost anyone else in the Nazi Empire. Killing him at 38 before his ambitions had fully played out, removed from the world, a figure whose continued presence might have shaped the history of the war and its aftermath in ways that are genuinely difficult to calculate. And then there is the dimension of what Operation Anthropoid meant for the people who carried it out and the people who supported them. The two young soldiers from Bohemia and Slovakia who trained in the Scottish Highlands and jumped from a Halifax bomber into a winter night over occupied Europe. The Czech families who opened their doors and their lives to men they knew would bring terrible danger. The bishop who refused to abandon the men in his crypt. The women of Lidis who marched into cattle trucks and were driven to Ravensbrück. The children of Lidis who died in the gas vans at Chelmno. The meaning of Operation Anthropoid cannot be reduced to strategic calculation alone. It was also, and perhaps primarily, a statement about human dignity and the refusal to accept occupation and oppression without response, a statement made at the highest possible cost by people who understood the cost completely. The legacy of Operation Anthropoid is not simple, and it would be dishonest to present it as such. The Czech government in exile made a decision that resulted in the deaths of thousands of Czech civilians who had no say in the matter. This is a fact, and the people of Lidis and of the wider protectorate who paid the price of that decision deserve to have it acknowledged. At the same time, resistance always operates in this territory. The alternative to resistance is not simply safety, it is a different kind of destruction. Slower and more comprehensive, the erasure not just of lives, but of the idea that fighting back is possible. The men who planned Operation Anthropoid and the men who carried it out chose to assert that fighting back was possible. They were right, and they paid for being right with everything they had. The question of the relative importance of different resistance actions during the Second World War is ultimately one for each person to weigh for themselves, with the knowledge of what was at stake, who was involved, and what the consequences were. But the case for Operation Anthropoid as the most consequential single act of political violence carried out against the Nazi regime during the entire war is strong, not primarily because of the man it killed, though that is significant, but because of the full breadth of what it demonstrated, that no one in the Nazi Empire was untouchable, that the exile governments were real fighting forces with the capacity to reach inside occupied territory and strike at its leaders, and that the spirit of resistance in occupied Europe was not crushed, not even by the most efficient terror apparatus in history. The two young men who cycled to a hairpin bend in Prague on a spring morning in 1942 proved something that the entire Nazi propaganda machine had been working to disprove: that occupied peoples had not given up and would not give up, and that the price of oppression, however high the oppressor was willing to make it, was never entirely one-sided. The streets around the cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius are quiet most mornings. Trams pass, students cycle, tourists with cameras pause at the entrance. Below the street level, in the preserved crypt, the bullet holes remain in the stone, and the water-stained marks on the walls still tell, for those who know what they're looking at, the story of what happened in that underground chamber in the last hours of June 18th, 1942. 7 men went in. None came out, and the man they had killed in the hairpin bend of a city street 3 weeks earlier is remembered by history not as the architect of a continuing empire of murder, but as the most consequential target of the most important assassination of the Second World War. The men who killed him were ordinary soldiers who did an extraordinary thing. The people who sheltered them were ordinary civilians who did an extraordinary thing. And the village of Lidis, destroyed in retaliation, became something it was never supposed to become: immortal, precisely because those who destroyed it wanted it forgotten. Among the most remarkable aspects of the Operation Anthropoid story is how thoroughly it illuminates the broader experience of resistance in Nazi-occupied Europe. The operation did not exist in a vacuum. It was part of a larger tapestry of clandestine struggle that involved hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of countries, each of them making individual decisions that, taken together, constituted a collective refusal to accept that the Nazi new order was permanent or legitimate. To understand Anthropoid fully, it is worth broadening the lens to consider the context in which it was conceived and executed, because the challenges faced by Gabčík and Kubiš were not unique to their mission, but representative of the conditions that shaped every major resistance operation of the war. The Special Operations Executive, the British organisation that trained and inserted the Anthropoid team, was itself a remarkable institution. Founded by Churchill's directive in July 1940 with the instruction to set Europe ablaze, the SOE operated in constant tension between its ambitions and its resources, between the boldness of its missions and the very incomplete understanding it had of conditions on the ground in occupied countries. It inserted thousands of agents and resistance workers into occupied Europe over the course of the war, and its record was inevitably mixed. Many of its operations were successful, many were disasters, ending in the capture, torture, and execution of the agents involved. The SOE's operations in the Netherlands, for example, were catastrophically compromised from a very early stage, resulting in the Englandspiel deception operation, in which German counterintelligence played back captured radio sets for nearly 2 years, feeding false information to London while systematically arresting every new agent inserted. More than 50 agents were captured and executed as a result. In Czechoslovakia, the SOE's relationship with Czechoslovak military intelligence under Colonel Moravec was generally more successful than in some other theatres, partly because of the quality of the Czechoslovak intelligence organisation itself, and partly because of the particular cultural and organisational discipline that Moravec and his colleagues brought to their operations. But even in Czechoslovakia, things could and did go wrong. Other parachute groups inserted at the same time as Anthropoid met with various fates. Some completed their missions successfully, some were captured and killed relatively quickly, and some, like the men of Silver A and Outdistance, survived for varying periods before the German security net closed around them or around the network supporting them. The men of Anthropoid, Gabčík, and Kubiš were among the most successful in terms of longevity and mission accomplishment, and their success owed a great deal to the extraordinary commitment of the Czech men and women who kept them alive. What was the experience of living underground in an occupied city for months, as Gabčík and Kubiš did from January to June 1942? The physical conditions were manageable, if uncomfortable. Prague's resistance network provided food, reasonably warm shelter, and the essential documentation required to move around the city. But the psychological conditions were something else entirely. Every day involved a performance of normalcy against a background of constant, omnipresent danger. Cycling through the streets of Prague, a city crawling with German soldiers and Gestapo informers, required the maintenance of a calm, unremarkable appearance at every moment, regardless of what was happening internally. Any unusual behavior, any visible nervousness, any failure to have the right documents or to give the right answers at a checkpoint could trigger the cascade that ended in arrest, interrogation, and execution. The stress of this existence, sustained over months, was profound. People who have studied the psychology of deep-cover operatives describe the experience as one that remakes the personality. You become, to a degree that can be frightening in retrospect, genuinely the person you are pretending to be, because the alternative, the constant conscious performance of a false identity, would eventually produce the kind of behavioral tells that get you caught. Gabčík and Kubiš managed this for 5 months in one of the most heavily occupied cities in Europe, and they did so well enough that the Gestapo, with all its resources, never found them through direct detection. They were found, in the end, only through betrayal. The question of how the Czech underground managed to sustain the paratroopers for so long is itself a fascinating study in resistance tradecraft and human solidarity. The basic answer is that Prague in 1942, for all the terror of the German occupation, was still a city of nearly 1 million people who were overwhelmingly Czech, and the capacity of a large urban population to conceal people within its midst should not be underestimated. The safe houses used by the paratroopers were not secret military installations. They were apartments, ordinary dwellings in ordinary residential neighborhoods, occupied by ordinary Czech families who had made the extraordinary decision to risk everything by allowing wanted men to sleep under their roofs. The forged identity documents that allowed the men to move around the city were produced by skilled craftsmen within the resistance network, people with the technical ability to produce convincing official papers under conditions of enormous difficulty. The communications channels that kept the paratroopers in contact with their handlers in the resistance and, indirectly, with London, involved a dedicated network of wireless operators, message carriers, and dead letter drops that had to be maintained and refreshed constantly to avoid detection. One of the most important characteristics of the people who sheltered and supported the paratroopers was what one might call an unusually high threshold for rationalized fear. This is not to minimize the fear they felt. They were afraid. Anyone who was not afraid in that situation would have been delusional. But they were able to manage their fear in a way that did not prevent them from acting. And this is a psychological quality that is rarer than it might appear. The behavioral economists who study decision-making under risk have found consistently that human beings are, on average, quite poor at managing the kind of existential risk that the helpers of the Anthropoid team faced daily. Most people, when threatened with death for actions they are about to take, choose not to take those actions, and this is, in purely individual terms, rational. What the helpers demonstrated was that there are circumstances in which purely individual rationality is insufficient as a guide to behavior, and that the maintenance of collective human dignity against systematic oppression is a value that can override personal survival calculations. This is not a comfortable observation for those who prefer their moral thinking neat and clean, but it is an honest one. The German security apparatus that Gabčík and Kubiš were evading during those months was not, despite its fearsome reputation, omniscient or infallible. The Gestapo in the Protectorate was effective and ruthless, but it was also stretched thin across an enormous territory, operating in a foreign culture and language, and fundamentally dependent on informers from within the Czech population for its intelligence about resistance activities. Without Czech informers, the Gestapo could not have operated with anything like its actual effectiveness. With them, it was formidable. The maintenance of a resistance network in this environment required constant attention to who could be trusted and who could not, and the history of occupation Europe is full of cases where the line between coerced cooperation and genuine collaboration was blurry in ways that make simple moral judgments difficult. The role of women in Operation Anthropoid and the broader Czech resistance of which it was a part deserves particular attention. The conventional narrative of the Second World War resistance tends to focus on the armed male operatives, the parachutists, the saboteurs, the armed partisan fighters. But much of the work that made these operations possible was done by women. Marie Moravec, who died by suicide rather than be taken by the Gestapo, the wives and daughters and sisters who served as message carriers, whose shopping trips and church visits and social calls concealed the movement of information and supplies, the women of the Zelenka Hajski network who performed the 1,000 small, unglamorous, essential tasks that kept the paratroopers alive. They were not passive bystanders. They were active participants in a resistance that could not have functioned without them, and they paid the same price as everyone else when the Gestapo came. Ravensbrück, execution, the destruction of everything they had. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the specific moral geography of the choice that each of these helpers made, because it illuminates something essential about the nature of resistance. Every person who sheltered a parachutist, carried a message, forged a document, or simply kept a secret that they were not required to keep, made an active choice. They were not simply responding to immediate physical threat as one might kill in self-defense. They were choosing in advance and with some degree of rational deliberation to take on a risk of extraordinary severity for a goal that was abstract, distant, and not immediately connected to their own personal survival. The families on Biskupkova Street, the bishop in his cathedral, the teacher who organised safe houses, they all had the option of not doing what they did. The Germans were not requiring Czech civilians to actively shelter paratroopers. The choice not to shelter them, to simply live one's life as normally as possible under occupation and survive, was available to most of these people. They chose otherwise. The reasons for that choice, the mixture of patriotism, moral outrage, solidarity, religious commitment, and simple human decency that produced it, are not simple to analyse, but the choice itself was real and it was consequential, and it deserves to be named clearly for what it was, an act of moral courage of the highest order. The legacy of the betrayal by Karol Czorda raises different and uncomfortable questions. What drove a trained soldier, a man who had made the same commitment as Gabčík and Kubiš to the mission of liberation, to walk into Gestapo headquarters and destroy the network of people who had sustained him? The historical record is not sufficient to give a fully satisfying psychological account of this, and Czorda's own statements at his post-war trial were, understandably, not entirely reliable. Fear is the most obvious factor. The German reprisals after Heydrich's death had created a climate of terror that tested the will of even the most committed resistance members. The practical calculation of personal safety against collective loyalty is one that many people, in many different circumstances, resolve in favour of personal safety, and to condemn Czorda without acknowledging the extraordinary pressure under which he was operating would be to apply a standard of heroism that relatively few human beings can meet. But understanding is not the same as excusing. Czorda's action directly caused the deaths of people who had trusted him and who had taken enormous risks on his behalf. The Moravec family, the clergy of the cathedral, the paratroopers themselves who might conceivably have found another means of escape in different circumstances. Their fates were shaped in part by his decision. Whatever the psychological mechanisms that produced that decision, the consequences were real and they were devastating, and the Czech legal system's subsequent decision to prosecute and execute him for treason reflects a society's judgment that there are acts of betrayal so serious, with consequences so severe, that they cannot be accommodated by any amount of psychological understanding. The tension between understanding and accountability is one of the enduring tensions of transitional justice in the aftermath of occupation and atrocity, and the case of Karol Czorda illustrates it with particular clarity. The Nuremberg trials and the broader project of post-war justice in Germany did not deal directly with Operation Anthropoid, since Heydrich himself was dead, and the German officials most immediately responsible for the reprisals either died before the war's end or faced judgment in Czechoslovakia rather than international courts. Karl Hermann Frank, who as the senior German official in the Protectorate had been the primary organiser of the reprisals against Lidis and Ležáky and against the broader Czech civilian population, was captured by American forces in 1945, extradited to Czechoslovakia, tried before a Czechoslovak national court, and executed by hanging in Prague on May 22, 1946. His execution was conducted in public at the Pankráč prison in Prague before a crowd of several thousand Czechs who had lived under his terror and who came to watch the end of it. Whether public executions serve the cause of justice is a question that reasonable people debate, but there is something historically appropriate about the fact that Frank's reckoning came in the city where his crimes were committed, before the people who had suffered under them. The Wannsee villa, where Heydrich had chaired the conference that coordinated the Holocaust just months before his death, was eventually turned into a memorial and educational centre, the house of the Wannsee Conference, which opened to the public in 1992 on the 50th anniversary of the original meeting. It stands today as one of the most important Holocaust memorial sites in Germany, a place where school groups and researchers and ordinary visitors come to confront the historical reality of how ordinary bureaucratic processes were applied to the project of mass murder. The conference room where Heydrich sat has been reconstructed to resemble its 1942 appearance as closely as possible. The surviving copy of the Wannsee Protocol, the minutes of the conference that Adolf Eichmann prepared under Heydrich's direction, is displayed in facsimile. Walking through those rooms, it is possible to understand, with a concreteness that no amount of abstract historical reading can fully replicate, how a roomful of officials in suits sat around a table and planned the murder of 11 million people over lunch. The children of Lidis, who were selected for Germanization and placed with German families, represent one of the most heartbreaking specific threads of the Lidis story. Of the 88 children taken from the village, only 17 would survive the war, and their stories of survival and rediscovery of identity were extraordinarily complex. Placed with German families under new names, raised in German culture and language with no memory, in some cases of who they had been before, these children had to reconstruct their identities after the war ended, often with very little information about their origins, about what had happened to their families, and about the village that no longer existed. The process of locating and reunifying these children with surviving relatives was undertaken by Czechoslovak authorities after the liberation, and it was partial and painful. Some children were found, some were not. Some had been so thoroughly Germanized that they experienced the rediscovery of their Czech identity as a second uprooting rather than a homecoming. The individual stories of these children are a microcosm of everything that was most terrible and most humanly complex about the Nazi occupation of Central Europe. The new village of Nové Lidice, built near the site of the destroyed original village after the war, was completed in 1949 and became home to the surviving women of Lidis who returned from Ravensbrück and other camps. The original site of the village was left as open ground, a meadow marked by a garden of roses and a series of memorial sculptures. The most famous of these is the sculpture by Marie Uchitilova, a massive bronze group of 82 figures representing the children of Lidis who were murdered. The sculpture, which was not completed and installed until 2000, more than 50 years after the end of the war, is one of the most powerful works of Holocaust memorial art in existence. The children are rendered in extraordinary detail, their individual faces and postures capturing something of the specific, irreducible particularity of each human life that was taken. Standing before it, you cannot abstract the deaths of the children of Lidis into a statistic or a historical fact. You are compelled to see them as individual human beings, each one unique, each one murdered for the crime of having been born in a particular village in a particular occupied country. The memorial, too, the paratroopers at the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius, has its own specific quality of historical preservation. Unlike many memorial sites that have been reconstructed or heavily interpreted, the crypt of the cathedral retains its basic 1942 character with very little alteration. The bullet holes in the walls are original. The cramped dimensions of the space are original. The narrow air shaft through which the Germans pumped water is the same one. You stand in the space where Gabčík and his 3 comrades spent their final hours, and the closeness of the walls and the relative smallness of the chamber forces a physical understanding of what that final stand actually looked like. Not a cinematic battle in a large heroic space, but 4 exhausted men in a cramped underground room, fighting with whatever they had left, knowing exactly what was going to happen and choosing to meet it on their own terms. The physical reality of the space makes the heroism and the tragedy more, not less, comprehensible. The ripples from Operation Anthropoid extended far beyond Czechoslovakia and far beyond the immediate moment of 1942. To trace those ripples fully is to understand how a single act of resistance, carried out by 2 men with a jammed gun and a grenade, became embedded in the political and cultural life of an entire nation and reshaped the moral landscape of the war itself. It is also to confront some of the hardest questions that the history of the Second World War poses to those who study it. Questions about the relationship between means and ends, about the nature of military necessity, about who has the right to make decisions that impose terrible costs on innocent people, and about how subsequent generations are to remember and honor sacrifice without romanticizing it in ways that distort its actual meaning. The political consequences of the assassination for the post-war settlement of Central Europe were significant and have been underappreciated in much of the historical literature written outside of the Czech and Slovak contexts. When the British government formally repudiated the Munich Agreement in August 1942, this was not an isolated diplomatic gesture. It was a change in the legal and political framework within which the post-war settlement of Czechoslovakia would eventually be negotiated, and it had direct implications for the question of what would happen to the 3.5 million Sudeten Germans who had lived in the border regions of Bohemia and Moravia that Germany had absorbed in 1938. By declaring Munich void, Britain implicitly committed itself to supporting the restoration of Czechoslovakia within its pre-1938 borders, which meant a post-war Czechoslovakia that would include a large German minority population that had, with many individual exceptions, enthusiastically supported the annexation of their region to the Reich. The subsequent expulsion of the Sudeten Germans in 1945 and 1946, in which approximately 3 million people were forcibly removed from their ancestral homes in what is now the Western Czech Republic, was one of the largest forced population transfers in European history, and its legitimacy as a policy response to the Nazi occupation is a question that remains politically sensitive in both the Czech Republic and Germany to this day. Operation Anthropoid did not determine this outcome alone, but it contributed materially to the diplomatic framework that made it possible. The relationship between the British government and the Czechoslovak government in exile was also changed by Anthropoid. Before the assassination, Beneš and his government were valued but not always central partners in the broader Allied strategic equation. They provided intelligence, they supplied pilots and soldiers, but they were a relatively small cog in a very large machine. After Anthropoid and the worldwide attention it attracted, the Czechoslovak government in exile was recognized as something more significant, a government capable of planning and executing operations of strategic importance in occupied Europe, a genuine military and intelligence actor that deserved to be taken seriously as a partner in the planning of the post-war settlement. This enhanced status had practical consequences for the negotiations over the future shape of Czechoslovakia and for the political position that Beneš was able to secure in the post-war international order. The intelligence implications of Heydrich's death were also significant, though harder to quantify. As head of the Reich Security Main Office, Heydrich had access to the highest levels of German intelligence and counterintelligence operations across occupied Europe. His death meant that this knowledge was no longer being applied by its most formidable practitioner. The disruption to German counterintelligence operations in the months following his death, while not total, was real. Several resistance networks that had been under monitoring by German security services escaped the final roundup that Heydrich's office had been preparing for them. The precise scope of what was lost to German intelligence through his death is impossible to calculate from the outside, but within the German security community itself, the loss was recognized as significant. There is also the question of what Heydrich might have become had he lived. This is necessarily speculative, but it is not frivolous. By 1942, Heydrich was 38 years old, already one of the most powerful individuals in the Nazi Empire, and he was not a man content to stay still. His ambitions were apparent to everyone who knew him. Himmler, despite his outward confidence in Heydrich, was reportedly uneasy about his deputy's trajectory and the breadth of his capabilities. Several historians have suggested that Heydrich's relationship with Hitler was evolving in a way that might eventually have led to Heydrich in some kind of preeminent political role, potentially as a successor to Himmler or in some other expanded capacity. Whether this trajectory would have continued through the natural politics of the Nazi hierarchy, with its ceaseless internal competition and its ultimate dependence on Hitler's favour, is unknowable. But the theoretical possibility that the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference might have survived the war and played an even more central role in the Third Reich's later years is one reason why some historians are prepared to argue that Heydrich's death was among the most consequential of the entire war. The medical history of Heydrich's wound and death has attracted considerable attention, not only from historians but from medical researchers interested in the history of sepsis and the development of antibiotic therapy. The decision by Karl Gebhardt not to administer sulfonamide antibiotics to Heydrich has been analysed in the context of the evolving medical understanding of those drugs in 1942. Sulfonamides, the first antibacterial drugs, had been developed in the 1930s and by 1942 were in widespread military use for treating wound infections. They were not perfect, but they were effective against many of the bacterial species likely to cause sepsis from a contaminated wound injury. The standard protocol at many military hospitals by 1942 included sulfonamide prophylaxis for significant penetrating wounds. Gebhardt's choice not to follow this protocol is documented, and his own subsequent explanation, given after the war when he was tried at the doctor's trial at Nuremberg and convicted of war crimes for his experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Ravensbrück, was that he believed the drugs were not necessary given the apparent progress of Heydrich's recovery. Gebhardt was executed for his crimes at Landsberg prison on June 2, 1948. His trial and execution had nothing specifically to do with Heydrich's treatment, but the proximity in time between his management of Heydrich's case and his contemporaneous experiments on concentration camp prisoners at Ravensbrück, in which he intentionally infected wounds and denied treatment to observe the progression of sepsis, has led many historians to note a disturbing potential connection. It is conceivable, though not proven, that Gebhardt's decision regarding Heydrich was influenced by, or at least consistent with, his research interest in the natural progression of wound infections without pharmaceutical intervention. If this connection is real, it would mean that Heydrich, of all the terrible ironies in this story, may have died in part because the physician sent to care for him was more interested in observing the natural progression of his infection than in treating it. The poetic justice, if that is not too gentle a phrase, would be extraordinary. The man who authorized and oversaw the Wannsee Conference, who built the infrastructure of the Holocaust, who organized the Einsatzgruppen that killed hundreds of thousands of people across Eastern Europe, may have died as an unwitting experimental subject of one of the very doctors whose human experimentation programs were part of the broader Nazi medical atrocity. History does not usually deliver such precisely calibrated ironies, and the evidence for this specific connection is circumstantial, but it cannot be entirely dismissed. The figure of Reinhard Heydrich has attracted a remarkable amount of biographical attention, more than almost any other Nazi official below the level of Hitler and Himmler. This is not, or should not be, because he is admirable in any way. It is because he represents a particular and profoundly disturbing type. The intelligent, capable, sophisticated individual who places all of these qualities entirely in the service of evil without apparent conflict or hesitation. The historian Robert Gerwarth, whose biography of Heydrich published in 2011, is probably the most comprehensive and carefully researched account of his life, described him as representing a particular kind of modern evil that was inseparable from the administrative and bureaucratic machinery of the modern state, not the charismatic fanatic whose evil is expressed in personal violence and ideological passion, but the cool, competent administrator whose evil is expressed in the efficiency with which he manages systems of mass murder. This type, Gerwarth argues, is in some ways more dangerous and more difficult to understand than the passionate fanatic, precisely because it operates through mechanisms that are recognizable as normal administrative and bureaucratic processes that have simply been directed toward monstrous ends. The Wannsee Conference was, in its form, an ordinary interdepartmental coordination meeting. It was its content that made it one of the most terrible events in human history. The way that Operation Anthropoid has been remembered and taught in Czechoslovakia, and subsequently in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, after the peaceful dissolution of the country in 1993, reflects the complex politics of national memory in post-communist Central Europe. During the communist period from 1948 to 1989, the memory of the resistance was complicated by the political priorities of the communist government. The exile government in London, and figures like Beneš, who led it, were associated with the Western orientation that the communists wanted to downplay. The emphasis in communist-era remembrance of the resistance was on the role of the communist underground in Czechoslovakia rather than on the London-directed operations, and the specific story of Anthropoid was presented in ways that sometimes minimized the role of Beneš and Moravec, while attempting to fit the narrative into a communist framework of class struggle and anti-fascist resistance. The result was a period of roughly 40 years in which the full story of Operation Anthropoid was somewhat distorted in its official presentations within Czechoslovakia itself. After 1989 and the Velvet Revolution that ended communist rule, there was a significant effort to recover and reassess the history of the resistance in its full complexity, including Operation Anthropoid. Archives were opened that had been inaccessible under communism, Oral testimonies of surviving witnesses and participants were collected before that generation was entirely gone. Historians in both the Czech Republic and Slovakia, working in collaboration with international colleagues, produced new and more complete accounts of the operation and its context. The Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius Memorial was significantly expanded and improved. Educational programs were developed that brought the story to successive generations of Czech and Slovak schoolchildren. Today, Operation Anthropoid occupies a central place in the national historical memory of both countries, regarded as one of the defining moments of the Second World War for the Czechoslovak people and one of the most significant acts of resistance in the entire history of the occupation of Europe. The international recognition of what happened in Prague in 1942 has grown substantially in the decades since the end of the Cold War. The opening of previously classified archives in Britain, particularly the records of the SOE and of the various British intelligence agencies that were involved in the planning and support of Anthropoid, provided new detail about the British side of the operation and confirmed the degree to which Moravec and the Czechoslovak military intelligence worked as genuine partners with the British rather than simply as recipients of British direction. The historical picture that has emerged from this archival work is of an operation that was genuinely collaborative in its planning, that drew on the specific expertise and knowledge of the Czechoslovak Exile Intelligence Service in ways that the British could not have replicated independently, and that was carried out at every level from Moravec's office in London to the safe houses in Prague by people whose commitment was genuine and whose capabilities were real. One of the most poignant specific details of the Operation Anthropoid story is the fate of Heydrich's family after his death. His wife, Lena von Osten Heydrich, who had married him in 1931, just months after he joined the SS, outlived him by more than 40 years. She died in 1985. During the years after the war, she made no secret of her continued belief in her husband and her lack of regret about the role she had played as his wife and the hostess of his household in Prague. She wrote a memoir that whitewashed Heydrich's role and presented him as a loyal soldier unjustly maligned by history. She sued publishers and historians who presented evidence of her husband's crimes. She lived comfortably for many years in Bavaria and eventually on the island of Fehmarn. She was never tried for any crime. Her husband's archive and personal papers were in her possession for many years after the war, which severely complicated historical research on Heydrich. She was, in short, an unreconstructed Nazi to the end of her long life, and her very comfortable post-war existence is a reminder that justice after the war was far from uniformly applied. Heydrich's 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, faced different fates. Klaus Heydrich, the eldest, was killed in a road accident in October 1943, struck by a vehicle while cycling near Panenské Břežany, where his mother was still living at the time. He was 10 years old. Heider Heydrich, the second son, survived the war, grew up in West Germany, worked in the music business, and lived a private life in Bavaria. He avoided public attention for most of his life and reportedly refused to discuss his father with journalists or historians. The youngest child, Silke, grew up similarly in West Germany. The experience of being the children of one of the most notorious figures in the history of the Nazi regime is one that several such individuals have described in terms of a peculiar double burden. The weight of a name and a legacy that they did not choose and cannot escape, combined with the pressure to somehow respond to or account for a father who committed crimes beyond the ordinary moral scale. How any human being navigates that situation is a question without a satisfying answer. The physical landscape of the Operation Anthropoid story has changed significantly in the 8 decades since 1942, but the key sites remain accessible and have been preserved with care. The Holešovič Bend where the attack occurred is now marked with a commemorative plaque. The street names in the surrounding area have been changed multiple times over the decades, reflecting the political changes of Czech history, but the physical curve of the road that forced Heydrich's Mercedes to slow is still there, unchanged by any amount of political transition. The Bulovka Hospital, where Heydrich was treated, still operates as a functioning medical facility, and a small memorial in the building marks the room where he died. The Panenské Břežany estate, Heydrich's official residence as Reich Protector, is now a school and children's facility, its Nazi past acknowledged in small memorials on the grounds. The question of how to present and teach the story of Operation Anthropoid to young people, particularly in an age when the last living witnesses to the events of the Second World War are dying, and the events themselves are becoming historical rather than living memory, is one that educators in both the Czech Republic and across the wider world engaged with the history of the Nazi occupation have been grappling with for decades. The story has qualities that make it particularly suited to educational use. It has specific, named individuals rather than anonymous masses. It operates on a human scale that allows students to engage with it emotionally, as well as intellectually. It raises profound moral questions that do not have simple answers, and it demonstrates both the courage of resistance and the horrifying price that can be exacted for it. The comparison with other major assassination operations of the Second World War is worth making briefly, not to rank them in some kind of heroic hierarchy, but to understand what made Anthropoid distinctive. The series of plots against Hitler himself, culminating in the July 20th, 1944 attempt by Klaus von Stauffenberg, were carried out by individuals within the German military establishment itself, acting from a combination of strategic, moral, and personal motivations that were deeply intertwined. They failed, and their failure had enormous consequences for the German resistance movement and for the remaining 10 months of the war. The Anthropoid operation was fundamentally different in that it was an external operation, conducted by foreign-trained soldiers operating in occupied territory, targeting a figure who was not the ultimate political leader, but who was, in operational terms, arguably the most dangerous individual below Hitler in the hierarchy of the final solution. The external character of the operation gave it a different moral and political texture from the internal German resistance, and its success, where so many internal plots failed, demonstrates something important about the difference between small, well-planned, externally supported operations and the larger, more complex conspiracies that characterized the internal German resistance. The men and women of the Czech and Slovak resistance who supported Operation Anthropoid were, by any reasonable assessment, among the bravest people of the entire Second World War. This is not a statement that diminishes the courage of resistance fighters in France, Poland, the Netherlands, Norway, Yugoslavia, or anywhere else. It is simply a recognition that the specific conditions of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, with its heavy German administrative control, its culture of collaboration enforced by terror, and its geography that offered fewer of the remote rural hiding places available to guerrilla fighters in Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union, made the kind of urban resistance practiced by the helpers of Anthropoid extraordinarily difficult. They operated in one of the most controlled environments in occupied Europe, and they sustained a world historical operation for months. The cost, when it came, was devastating. But the achievement, measured against the conditions, was extraordinary. What would Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš have thought if they could have known, in the moment they chose to accept the Anthropoid mission, everything that would follow from their action? The successful killing of Heydrich, the reprisals, the destruction of Lidis, the deaths of their helpers, their own deaths in the cathedral crypt, and then the longer arc of consequence, the repudiation of Munich, the post-war settlement, the memorials, the films, the 80 years of historical attention. Neither of them was a man given to philosophical abstraction, as far as the historical record suggests. Gabčík was a practical man, a locksmith's son who became a soldier because his country needed soldiers. Kubiš was warm and decent and straightforward, not a natural ideologue. They accepted their mission because they believed it was right and because they were capable of acting on that belief regardless of the personal cost. This is, in its simplest and most fundamental form, the definition of courage. Not the absence of fear, not the absence of calculation, but the decision to act rightly regardless of what the calculation shows. The world in which they made that decision was one in which the most powerful empire in Europe was engaged in the systematic murder of millions of people, and in which the question of whether any meaningful resistance was possible at all was genuinely open. They answered that question. The answer cost them their lives, and cost many others their lives as well, and the full weight of that cost must be acknowledged without reduction or romanticization. But the answer they gave has outlasted the empire they were fighting. The Nazi Third Reich lasted 12 years. The story of the two men who killed its most dangerous official has lasted more than 80 and will last longer still. The final reckoning for the perpetrators of the reprisals following Heydrich's death extended beyond Karl Hermann Frank. The German commanders and officials who organized the destruction of Lidis and Ležáky and who directed the broader terror campaign of the summer of 1942 were identified, where possible, and prosecuted after the war. The trials conducted by Czechoslovak courts in the years immediately following liberation were not perfect instruments of justice. The evidence was sometimes incomplete, the legal standards varied, and the emotional intensity of a society emerging from years of occupation made truly dispassionate proceedings difficult. But the effort was real, and many of those responsible for the worst atrocities of the occupation did face legal consequences. The executions of Frank and others were public affirmations that the Nazi claim to have operated within the bounds of legitimate authority was rejected absolutely by the society that had suffered under that authority. The broader project of denazification in Germany, which ran alongside the more specific Czechoslovak prosecutions, was a deeply imperfect process. Millions of Germans who had been members of the Nazi Party, who had participated in various degrees in the machinery of the Nazi state, were processed through a bureaucratic system that often produced outcomes that bore little relationship to actual moral culpability. The higher-ranking officials who appeared at Nuremberg and in the successor trials received serious attention, but the vast middle layers of the Nazi administrative apparatus, the bureaucrats, the minor officials, the local functionaries who had implemented Nazi policy day by day in 1,000 different contexts, were largely absorbed back into West German society with relatively limited consequences. The Federal Republic of Germany was built in part on a calculated decision to allow former Nazis to participate in the new state, on the theory that excluding all of them would leave the country without the experienced administrators and professionals it needed to function. Whether this calculation was right in practical terms and whether it was morally defensible in ethical terms are questions that German society has been wrestling with for 70 years and has not yet fully resolved. The Czech and Slovak societies also went through their own post-war reckoning, one complicated by the communist takeover of 1948 and the subsequent 40 years of communist rule during which the history of the war was selectively appropriated for political purposes. The post-1989 democratic transition opened space for a more honest and complete engagement with the wartime past, including not only the heroism of the resistance, but also the instances of collaboration, the ambiguities of behavior under occupation, and the complex moral landscape of a society trying to survive under conditions of systematic terror. This engagement continues in both the Czech Republic and Slovakia, driven by historians, educators, filmmakers, and by a public that has remained remarkably engaged with the memory of the occupation and the resistance. One of the most striking aspects of the contemporary memory of Operation Anthropoid in the Czech Republic is the degree to which it remains emotionally alive, rather than simply historically archived. When the Anthropoid film was released internationally in 2016, the response in the Czech Republic was markedly different from the reception in other countries. It was received as an event of cultural significance, not merely as a piece of entertainment, and it prompted wide public discussion about the history it depicted. The memorial events held annually at the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius on June 18th, the anniversary of the final battle, draw large crowds. The debate about whether the operation was worth its cost, which in other countries might be an abstract historical argument, remains in the Czech Republic a question with genuine emotional weight, connected to specific places, specific family histories, and specific names that many Czechs still associate with living memory through parents and grandparents who lived through the occupation. This emotional aliveness of historical memory is itself a form of resistance, the refusal to let what happened become merely past, the insistence that the dead and their choices remain present in the consciousness of the living. It is what the Nazis, with their destruction of Lidis and their attempt to erase the very name of the village from the map, were trying to prevent. They failed. Not only does Lidis exist as a place, it exists as an idea, embedded in the cultural and moral consciousness of the Czech Republic and of a much wider international community that learned the name in 1942 and has not forgotten it. Every schoolchild who visits the Rose Garden at the Lidis Memorial, every visitor who stands before the sculpture of the 82 children, every historian who writes about the events of May and June 1942 in Prague is participating in the long refusal of erasure. Against the ambition of the Nazi regime to remake the world according to its ideology and to destroy what could not be remade, the persistence of memory is itself a political and moral act. The story of Operation Anthropoid is, finally, a story about what individual human beings are capable of when they are called to act by a world that has lost its moral centre. Most of the people involved in this story, on the side of the resistance, were ordinary by any usual measure: a locksmith's son from Slovakia, a farmer's son from Moravia, a schoolteacher from Prague, a bishop, the women of a mining village. None of them had asked to be placed in circumstances that required extraordinary courage. None of them had sought out the role of hero or martyr. They were people who found themselves in an extraordinary moment and responded to it with an extraordinary quality that human beings possess, but do not always find occasion to demonstrate: the capacity to act rightly even when the cost of acting rightly is everything. What they did matters not only because of the specific historical consequences, which are real and significant, but because of what it demonstrates about human possibility. In a world that had produced the Wannsee Conference and the gas vans and the Einsatzgruppen, it had also produced Jan Kubiš, cycling through the streets of Prague with a grenade in his briefcase and Josef Gabčík stepping into the road with a gun that was about to jam, and Marie Moravec choosing a cyanide capsule over betrayal, and Bishop Gorazd offering himself as a hostage for men he could easily have surrendered. They remind us, at a distance of more than 80 years, that the same world that produces systematic evil also produces the capacity to resist it, and that this capacity is not reserved for heroes or saints, but is available to ordinary people who choose to use it. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into Operation Anthropoid as fascinating and as moving as we did. The story of Gabčík and Kubiš, of the cathedral crypt, of Lidis, and of the extraordinary web of courage and sacrifice that surrounded the most important assassination of the Second World War is one that deserves to be told and retold, because the people at the centre of it deserve to be remembered. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about the July 20th plot, the closest anyone ever came to killing Adolf Hitler, and what happened to the conspirators when it failed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next exploration of the hidden history of the Second World War. See you in the next one.